We're beginning the second day of the Road to Recovery workshop, identifying causes of bird declines, and we'll wait just a couple minutes as people continue to file into the Zoom room. I see we're up to some 80 participants at this point, and people are still calling in. So I'll wait just a minute or two. Everyone to the second day of this two-day Road to Recovery Phase 1 workshop, identifying the causes of bird declines. And I want to thank everybody for your participation in yesterday's sessions, including what I hear were very engaging conversations last night during happy hour. We all recognize that this virtual environment can be challenging at times, but I'd like to make a big shout out to our speakers and panelists yesterday who did such a really great job keeping us on time and on track. And I thank again the 99 plus participants that, even though we couldn't see and hear you, for your comments and suggestions in the Q&A. This is Tom Will talking. I'll be serving again today as the meeting moderator, and I'll be introducing speakers and handing off questions from the Q&A, which is open at the bottom of your screen, to today's panelists. I just want to mention that as we talked about yesterday, this initial workshop, the two 2.5-hour sessions over the next 2 days, comprises only a morning's worth of the 3 days in-person workshop that we had intended for Asilomar, and for which we actually created a fairly lengthy agenda. We had a plan for a suite of more intensive topic-oriented breakout sessions in that original Asilomar agenda, and including quite a few other people who would be giving mini talks or talks to explore other arenas and dig into the details of the work needed to be done in order to identify and address causes of decline. For example, yesterday we didn't spend a lot of time discussing migratory connectivity, population structure, genetic structure, the contribution of genetics, or really dig into the details of demographic monitoring, other than the high level view that we got from our speakers. And we anticipate that these topics will form the content for future focused workshops leading up to an in-person workshop as soon as that becomes feasible given the current health situation. I'll come back to this at the end of today's session, but we will need your help in planning those sessions, as well as your ideas about what is going to be most needed to move forward. And we'll talk more about that at the end of the day. So I just want to point out that, as was the case yesterday, the Zoom chat function has been disabled when we're using this webinar platform. We did receive some feedback that folks appreciated not being distracted by a spiraling public chat, so that they could focus better on the speaker content. And that's what we hope will happen today again as well. Again, I want to point out that we have provided a Google Doc comment board for participants and panelists to record questions, comments, and suggestions. And hopefully this will be most active after the webinars will have concluded, a way to just keep in touch with ideas focused on the road to recovery. And that link is on the bottom of the slide that you're seeing now, but I will send that out along with other information at the conclusion of all the workshops. Again, as yesterday's, questions, both logistic and those intended for the speakers and panelists, should be entered in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And just a little bit about what's going to happen today. Yesterday's content was focused largely on a high-level review of the technologies, the methodologies, strategies, issues, assumptions, and in many cases, barriers to identifying causes of decline and limiting factors for bird populations. Kind of a high-level, content-oriented review of what it means to look for limiting factors, smoking guns, and even to think about broad threats. Today, we intend to explore these topics in greater detail, but this time the idea is to put that exploration in the form of practicing context of case studies, where the techniques that we talked about yesterday were actually applied to identify causes of decline in the case of particular efforts to recover species, populations, or species groups in some cases. So today we'll begin with a keynote example from the world of waterfowl management, perhaps one of the most articulated and certainly well-funded examples of bird population response research and adaptive management. We'll follow that presentation with 4 15-minute presentations of case studies from other taxa, shorebirds, landbirds, and seabirds. And we'll follow that with a panel discussion similar to the one we had yesterday among the 5 presenters, including Scott Bloomer, the first presenter. And then after that, we'll have a session where Pete Mara and Ken Rosenberg will wrap up this first webinar series and talk about next steps. So that will be the plan for today. And therefore, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. That would be Scott Boomer. He's going to talk about evaluating population responses to national habitat and harvest management programs. What are the lessons learned from waterfowl management? Scott's a wildlife biologist in the branch of assessment and decision support with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Division of Migratory Bird Management. Since 2007, he's coordinated the service's adaptive harvest management program. Scott's research and management activities focus on the application of estimation, modeling, and optimization methods to adaptive approaches to decision-making in the face of uncertainty. He was Cornell all the way with a BS, MS, and PhD. And so, Scott, the show is yours.
Thanks, Tom. And thank you to the organizing committee for this opportunity. It's been a very interesting workshop so far, and I'm glad to have a chance to participate. I'd like to acknowledge first a whole host of collaborators who have been involved in some case studies that I'm going to go into some detail. And I'd like to highlight Orrin, Eric, and Brady, who are the postdocs that we got to do the bulk of the heavy lifting with regards to the technical apparatus that we developed to address some of these issues. As far as a roadmap for this presentation, you might be wondering, why are we discussing waterfowl in a workshop geared to identifying causes of bird decline, given that the Rosenberg et al. Paper, highlight the fact that waterfowl populations have seen an increase of 56% since the population levels observed in the 1970s. There are, as Tom mentioned, there's some pretty well-established monitoring programs that the waterfowl world is blessed with, and we still have some issues and some problem populations that we're dealing with that I think is highly relevant to the conversations that we're having in this workshop. I'd like to briefly discuss a decision context that we've been wrestling with, where we're trying to explicitly integrate harvest and habitat management programs at large spatiotemporal scales. Briefly discuss some of the details of the annual life cycle models we've developed to represent those processes, and then end with some takeaways based on the experiences we've been able to accumulate so far. So the scale which we're talking about for waterfowl management is truly continental. As I mentioned before, waterfowl managers have been the beneficiaries of some pretty forward-thinking individuals back in the 30s and 40s who established monitoring programs in the form of aerial surveys and band recovery programs, as well as administrators who sought for funding and the resources required for establishing the administrative flyways to regulate harvest, as well as establish a whole suite of joint ventures to support the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. This has culminated into 2 large-scale programs where we have fully adaptive harvest management programs for most of the stocks in the United States, as well as 30 years of experience with the North American Waterfowl Management Plan that has directed and provided guidance for habitat managers. However, we still have some concerns given these successes. And so I've just plotted from 1961 to 2019, our pond estimate, that's the number of ponds in Canada that we observe in our waterfowl breeding population habitat surveys, along with total ducks below it, and then northern pintail and scaup. And you can see, and along the mid-90s, when the water came back to the prairies, the habitat managers had definitely set the table for habitat. The birds experienced rapid population growth and took advantage of a lot of CRP and prime nesting conditions. And total duck populations exceeded population records in the last couple of years. However, scaup, pintail, and black duck have not responded favorably as the other species. And this has been cause for concern within the harvest management community. Obviously, we have developed formal adaptive harvest management programs to regulate harvest for these populations. And yet we still are asking questions as to how can we recover these populations to at least achieve the North American Waterfowl Management Plan goals. In concert with that temporal change in population sizes, there is this growing recognition within the waterfowl management community that we have had a lack of coherence between the population objectives of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan and harvest management. So Runge et al. Published a paper back in 2006 just highlighting this issue. And in that quote, it seems increasingly clear that the plan's waterfowl population objectives can only be useful for conservation planning and evaluation if they are accompanied by an explicit specification of the harvest strategy and environmental conditions under which they are to be achieved. So here we face this dilemma that there's the potential that the 2 major management programs for waterfowl could be working cross purposes. We recognize that, harvest and habitat management are linked, and yet, that habitat affects the size of the harvestable surplus that we intend to crop each fall. And yet the harvest also affects the distribution of birds across their available habitats throughout the annual life cycle. There's a growing recognition that these population goals need to have this harvest context. So the 2 programs are working toward common ends, but without a formal linkage, there's an opportunity for the opportunity for coherence between them and the ancillary benefits of a consistent set of objectives. So the waterfowl management community established a task force to really think through this issue and posit a technical framework for how we could achieve this type of decision making. And what they proposed is a yield curve approach that we typically use in harvest management as a means of guiding the specification of objectives for harvest and habitat management. So I'm just going to quickly walk through. This essentially graphically shows the decision context in which we're operating when we talk about integration. So from a harvest management perspective, under the theory of density dependent population responses, we can develop a yield curve. We can determine the equilibrium population size for any given harvest rate, where in the absence of harvest, the population will equilibrate at carrying capacity. That's this low corner right here. And then harvest is maximized at roughly half of K. The harvest management community has been discussing the impact of specifying shoulder strategies where we're not exactly trying to hone in on MSY, but a reduction in MSY where we fall off the shoulder. Recognizing that the corresponding equilibrium population size represents a reference point for which habitat managers can then begin to target their actions So that in their aspirational goals for habitat management and population response is in line with harvest management. The nice thing about this conceptual framework is that the shoulder point doesn't change as habitat conditions grow or weaken. We're still going to try and maintain that level of harvest, and yet the harvest management, the habitat management then has to seek ways or actions that expand this yield curve so that we can continue to crop the population at levels consistent with what the habitat managers deem a population goal should be. So it's under this guise of coherence that we've developed some ideas about how to link decision frameworks across these two major programs. Now, obviously, we have some challenges associated with this, and the biggest being that there's potential for the scales not to line up. Typically, in the United States, harvest management is top-down. We establish federal frameworks for which the states then select season lengths and bag limits on an annual basis, whereas habitat management tends to focus on local or within regional areas of actions on multi-annual timescales, and then pool these into continental level population responses that define their population objectives. So you can see that there's an opportunity for these scales to really impact how you go about linking harvest management decisions with habitat management decisions. So on the heels of this, technical framework for establishing, linked decisions through integration, it was recognized that perhaps the pintail, black duck, and scaup status and their harvest and habitat management programs might be able to use this overall integration framework to really see if we can link decisions. And so resources were pooled, and we were able to hire postdocs for 3 case studies that I want to talk to you about today. And the northern pintail really was a proof of concept. This is the project that Brady Madsen and Eric Osnes were involved with, where we wanted to see if we had the data, the modeling, and the technical tools to really see if we could model this system and consider linked decisions. The black duck and scaup exercises focus more on sort of this resource allocation issue, where they attempted to determine, given a limited pool of funds for habitat management, where would we get the biggest bang for our buck in terms of impacting a demographic response of these populations. All 3 of these case studies developed full annual life cycle models to represent the key demographic events to link up habitat and harvest management actions. So a little bit more detail here is sort of a schematic for the pintail model that Brady developed, I think one of his first publications of his postdoc, where we recognized there's multiple breeding locations, the prairie pothole region, Alaska, and this northern unsurveyed area, which essentially represents a sink from overflight years where the conditions aren't that good on the prairies and the birds essentially go to other parts. Recognizing multiple pathways for migration, and then multiple wintering areas where they're subjected to different harvests across the Pacific Flyway and then the Central Mississippi Flyway in the Gulf Coast area. What's really important is that all of these linkages offer opportunities to hone in on the key functional relationships that drive the parameter estimates that we were able to obtain. And that, I think, is the power of these full annual life cycle models, is it provides the structure in which to think about and hypothesize how important demographic parameters are going to respond to not only your management actions, but also environmental or habitat changes. I think this is borne out really well in the black duck example, where the full annual life cycle model facilitates the development of hypotheses. They offered up 3 hypotheses that they thought about testing, and that is where black ducks might be limited by breeding ground carrying capacity via changes in productivity, limited by non-breeding ground carrying capacity via changes in survival, and then limited by non-breeding ground carrying capacity via changes in productivity. It's sort of the cross-seasonal effects aspects of conditions on the wintering grounds impacting conditions on the breeding grounds, or at least performance on the breeding grounds. I don't think it's possible to postulate some of these hypotheses without having the underpinnings of a full annual life cycle model providing the structure to do that. So here's just a schematic of the black duck example, where they've got multiple breeding areas similar to the pintail example, and then multiple wintering areas where they may have different harvest regulations depending upon the state and the flyway. Key to this diagram is that the demographic rates are spatially explicit. That is, for each area, they may have a different reproductive rate or a different survival rate. And then the transitions from different areas may also differ. And the key thing that linked up this modeling exercise with their decision analysis, this is this notion that they may be able to estimate or at least represent how a key demographic parameter, according to their hypothesis, might change in relation to some type of limiting resource. And that's what's expressed here, and I think this logistic function. So now they've got a way to link a management action and an impact on some limiting factor that might drive carrying capacity for a particular area. And then a predictive model that says, you know, given this change in this resource or this condition, we're going to have this change in demographic parameter that then is embedded within a full annual life cycle model, which allows you to run different types of scenarios and test really what the impacts of these different relationships are going to be to the overall dynamics. And I think, as Steve mentioned yesterday, not only will you be able to sort of simulate that, but if you put it into a prospective environment, you can project what may be happening with regards to those demographic parameters through these models, and then go ahead and still develop monitoring programs to determine if that actually is the case. The idea that we can use monitoring information to learn about how parameters might change, which then leads you naturally to start thinking about how, in an adaptive management sense, you know, your policies might change given changes in those parameters. So I want to shift gears now and talk about some decision analyses that have supported these case studies. And I'm not going to show the full annual cycle diagram for SCOP. It's very similar to the pintail and the black duck example. However, it's over a much broader area because we consider both lesser and greater SCOP. And that also is a little bit more data poor. So we relied more on expert judgment and had a series of workshops with SCOP experts to develop this population model. And then what the group did is they thought carefully about how different policies or management actions might impact some of these key demographic parameters, whether it's the survival value or reproduction in different areas, in either the boreal forest or the prairies. And then made some educated guesses, developed some models that says, okay, if we change these parameters in this way, it's going to result in a population change. And here on the y-axis of this curve is just the difference between action versus no action. That is the population bump you would expect given a set of actions. And if you do this enough times with enough combinations of actions and portfolios of actions, you can develop this efficiency curve where this line essentially represents the efficiency frontier that says, given the actions that you're considering and the cost, this is the best that you can do given the scenarios that you've run. And, you know, recognizing that this was based on a lot of expert opinion and judgment, this exercise of carrying through the decision analysis really interrogated this population model and made people step back and say, well, is this right or is that not right? And in fact, it led the group to perform sort of an expected value of perfect information calculation to determine which pieces of uncertainty are most important, or where would we get the best gain of resolving that uncertainty in terms of our management performance. So it was a really interesting exercise in how the full annual life cycle model can be used in a decision-making context. The next example I want to discuss came out recently in the March issue of Scientific Reports of Nature. Brady Matson and colleagues was able to continue their work with the pintail example and did some extraordinary work. what's really compelling about this is that they were able to tackle the scaling issue of how do habitat management or land use practices on the ground, which might be at a regional scale, how do they then translate up to continental scale level metrics that we care about from a harvest management perspective, but also sort of drive the objectives formulations for the waterfowl population, for the habitat managers. And what they were able to do is empirically derive relationships about how certain agricultural practices or land use practices would result in changes in hen success. They had a lot of data they were able to mine to develop that, and then translate that from the regional scale to a continental age ratio that then drives the population size while accounting for the harvest process. And so you can see now we're in a position to say, okay, here are some regional habitat management actions that we're taking. This results in a change in hen success, resulting in a change in age ratio. And then this is what we would expect given all the other dynamics in the model that we're including as terms of population sizes. And they actually took it a next step further in that they were able to get realistic dollar values associated with these land uses and agricultural practices, and do some post hoc scenario analyses saying that, okay, how much would it take in dollars to influence this type of habitat feature to get the population to respond to a level greater than the North American Waterfowl Management Plan goal. So now we've got specific actions at landscape scale that managers can start to consider when thinking about what to do to benefit pintails. Really, really great work. And I think it's going to serve as sort of an example that we can draw from as we start to think about doing these types of things for the other stocks. So some basic conclusions. I think Conroy said it best in his black duck monograph when he was trying to evaluate what was going wrong with the status of black ducks. The ability to identify a single factor as the limiting factor of the black duck population using a strict hypothetical deductive approach is almost certainly impossible. I think, Steve made the point yesterday that limiting factors are dynamic in space and time, and the likelihood that we'll be able to identify the true smoking gun given the rapid system change that we're all operating under is probably unlikely. However, I think, the decision theoretic approach that we've been discussing to delivering conservation actions on the ground might be a more appropriate or useful approach to start thinking about how we can tackle, developing actions that can impact these limiting factors. Now, obviously, the problem framing and the key policy elements are going to be the most challenging aspects of this endeavor. The 3 case studies that I referred to spent a lot of time in multiple workshops sketching out what the key metrics of those problem statements were. And in fact, if that hadn't been done, I don't think we would have been able to get to the modeling process, because the bounds that the decision context sets ultimately has to drive how you formulate models. And then as we've learned in the harvest and habitat management arenas for waterfowl, the institutional mandates offer key challenges for integrating those linked decisions. Linking decisions across time and space is a significant obstacle. I think the Mattson et al. Paper is a very useful first step in trying to tackle that. Uncertainty is ubiquitous in these systems that we attempt to manage, but I think our success with adaptive harvest management might provide some tools, or at least direction about how we can use decision making, maybe to learn about system responses to not only our actions, but also the environmental changes that are occurring. And ultimately, the final decisions that any of these frameworks are going to inform are going to require trade-offs and careful thought about the types of the decision analyses that are going to inform these decisions. I think it's obvious that full annual life cycle models are required to do some of this work, and that the careful thought about the submodels is critical to link your actions to the demographic responses that are going to be occurring out there and allowing you to account for habitat and environmental change. This really is the structure in which to start thinking about the impact of limiting factors that they're having on not only the system, but also your ability to maybe think about how you could impact those relationships through your management. The bird community and the Fish and Wildlife Service, a lot of my colleagues that I interact with are very envious of the waterfowl management world, and that we have so much data available to us to develop models and to learn about system responses to management. However, I don't think a lack of data should preclude the development of these decision-making frameworks, especially if you're going to start thinking about how this work can be applied. Expert opinion and structures that have been put in place for other taxes may be a useful starting point to start thinking about how you can frame up these decision protocols relative to the population dynamics that you hope to represent. And then the decision analysis can also provide tools like the expected value of perfect information to help you prioritize which uncertainty you may want to resolve, as well as identify information gaps that you would have to plug. And I think we're learning this week that there's rapid advances in statistical and technical tools. Their expansion has increased the possibilities for collecting information for model development, as well as for the monitoring information that you're going to need to determine whether or not your management actions are successful, but also to serve as a basis for learning through your management. Thank you.
Scott, that was fantastic. Envy is definitely a word that is on my lips. I want to inform everybody that the Q&A is open, so anyone can ask a question of Scott, and hopefully they will start piling in. In the meantime, I guess other than expressing my envy, and I really appreciate the reference to Black Duck and the SCOP situation, which maybe has more parallels with some of the issues we're facing in the non-harvest species world. But this is, great for waterfowl. What would it take to apply this methodology to non-game species that are in the spiral of decline? And is there any? That's one question. And is there any analog to harvest management in the non-game, non-harvest world?
To get at your second question, yeah, I think there are analogs. Typically one of the issues that our office faces is how to inform take levels for nuisance species or populations that might be at odds with agriculture or something like that. And oftentimes there you're dealing with populations where you don't have good demographic information, but there are tools out there like potential take, PBRs, that can be used to at least get some type of skeleton of a population model in place to start thinking about what levels of exploitation might be commensurate with that population capacity to absorb that take. Another example, I guess, that we're wrestling with is sea ducks, where we don't have as good information, at least at a population level. Developing a PTL, the Sea Duck joint venture, sponsored that work, and a recent publication came out that highlighted some of the, essentially synthesized some information and used the PTL framework to sort of direct where the next monitoring efforts should be to shore up sort of that representation. I think if you can maybe use allometric relationships that drive survival, some basic life history information to cobble together some kind of fecundity estimate, you're well on your way to developing a population model. The trick then is going to be how do you relate that to the information that you're using to establish the status, right? You're intimating that there's a negative trend in a population that you care about. How do you take what you know of the reproductive capacity of that species or that population, couple that with maybe some baseline survival information, and then link that with the count information, or at least the relative abundance information, to sort of see how it all fits. I mean, I think that's the beauty of the integrated population models, right? They allow you to integrate multiple data sources, and folks are starting to find ways to fill in those gaps, whether it's through a very informed priors based on other taxa, or even hypothesized values through expert opinion. I think there are ways where you can start to begin to develop some population models that will be useful for these populations that you care about.
Great. Here's a question coming in. In your figure depicting desired harvest versus equilibrium population size, how did you set your North American goal? Is the process you went through published?
Well, so yeah, that's a great question. The 2018 plan update has just been released, or has been released. And there are revised population objectives, and I don't think we used a full, integrated platform to do that. I think the emphasis on this North American plan update was more on the human connections to, not only habitats and harvest, but also, how human dimensions might play in our management of waterfowl. So I don't think we explicitly did use the coherence framework to establish those goals.
Another question coming in. Can you talk a little more about using expert opinion? For example, is there a framework or existing process for obtaining that expert opinion? Are we talking about just science experts, or are resource managers included in that elicitation?
Yeah, I think the more folks you can bring to the table, the better off you're going to be. I'm definitely not an expert, but there are protocols in place and well-established procedures to extract information from a group of folks. In fact, the National Conservation Training Center, NCTC, where there's a lot of instruction for federal employees, they offer a course in expert elicitation. And I have not yet had a chance to take it, but I've heard very good things about it, and that's open to anyone. So you might check out that website to see what they go over, but they usually do a really good job of bringing in experts to facilitate the teaching of that material.
All right. Any other questions coming in? Ken, you have a question?
Yeah, let me just throw one out there. Thanks, Scott. That was, I agree with Tom in terms of the envy. I mean, we're just listening to that whole talk and trying to think how we would apply that to a Sprague's pipit or a rusty blackbird, or, it's very daunting, and we definitely need more help. That's another sort of integration that I think needs to happen. But my question, so at some point, and maybe this is not correct, but we all have this idea that, at some point in the past, in the 70s or before that, all duck populations, or many duck populations, were at a depressed level. And, it was kind of in a situation more similar to where we are with some of these other bird groups. And so I'm just wondering if you have, if you could talk a little bit about, or have recommendations about, what was done initially, to reverse those declines within this context to get you to the point where you could do this really cool sort of equilibrium management for the birds that are not declining.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think when I talk to some of the folks who've been involved with waterfowl management for a long time, they specifically talk about the dirty 30s, the 1930s, the Dust Bowl era, where soil practices, wetland practices were essentially the Wild West. And there were folks in the conservation realm who noticed what was happening. And so, similar to what Pete described yesterday, is sort of, whether it's Silent Spring or the millinery trade, measures were quickly put in place to conserve soil, to protect wetlands. There were federal sodbuster, federal programs put in place that really looked to preserve those habitats. And waterfowl are in a dynamic system, right? There's wet dry cycles that they have had to evolve over, the responses to. And the habitat managers really talk about setting the table so when conditions are good, they can really take advantage of those habitats. The drought conditions in the 60s and 70s or the early 80s, really resulted in questions about the role of harvest and how do you begin to start developing harvest policy and really shine the light on the uncertainties that we are still trying to resolve today. Like Scott mentioned yesterday, the idea about compensation and where that might occur and how does harvest actually affect annual survival. We're still wrestling with those relationships to this point, but we had monitoring programs in place. And I think that's been the strength of waterfowl management is we've always relied on the expectation that we could get that information on the heels of whatever decision we made. And that has really offered up the opportunity now to think about adaptive management, which we're employing for our harvest. And I hope that
Here's a question from Steve Beisinger. The question is that in 1991, lead was banned from waterfowl hunting. And soon after that, the population trends of waterfowl, and at least as expressed in the 3 billion bird paper, starts increasing. Can you address this as an underlying cause for the national trends?
I don't know if we would have the information to do that from a causal analysis. I mean, I think that there is data out there suggesting that lead poisoning has declined given those efforts to ban lead. That also was coincident with the return of water to the prime breeding areas. So, they're probably not mutually exclusive, or I mean, they probably are. They probably both added to population response that we saw towards the end of the 90s.
All right, great. Well, thanks so much. We're going to move on now to 4 other case studies: shorebirds, landbirds, and seabirds. And Jim Lyons, and we're going to go through all 4 of these talks, and then at the conclusion of all 4 talks, we'll come back to kind of a panel discussion framework. So Jim Lyons is going to start us off. Jim is a research ecologist with the USGS at Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. And before joining USGS, he was a migratory bird program wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 9 years. He specializes in applied quantitative ecology and decision science for natural resource management, especially in support of the U.S. Shorebird Conservation Plan, and is a great structured decision analysis coach. Jim mentored me in my early days of learning structured decision analysis. Jim looks forward to going to Nationals Park and watching. When I heard Jim say this, I read that as he looks forward to going to national parks, but no, he looks forward to going to Nationals Park and watching a baseball game again someday. So take it away, Jim.
Great, thank you, Tom. And let me know if my video or audio is not coming through.
Right now.
Good, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Tom, Pete, and Ken for the invitation. It's great to be here, and thanks to everyone tuning in, joining the meeting. So my talk today is about conservation challenges in the annual cycle of red knots. And so I'm going to do a brief review of the annual cycle and try to highlight some of the aspects of this bird's natural history that present conservation challenges. Then I'm going to try to talk about knowledge gaps, or briefly list a few knowledge gaps and management actions as we try to move into implementing management to recover this and other birds. And then finally, the last thing I want to do today is try to tackle this question that has been proposed by the organizers, and that is, given the number of species with declining populations and limited resources for implementing management actions for recovery, is there a way for us to think about implementing management for multiple species in a cost-effective way? And I think shorebirds as a group had 68% of their populations in decline, and I think that was the highest of any group. And so maybe this question is or this group is a good place to start with that question. So one of the most interesting things about red knots in the Atlantic Flyway is that they maintain 3 distinct wintering areas separated by thousands of miles. The first wintering area is here in southwestern Florida and the Caribbean. The second wintering area is on the northeast coast of Brazil. And the third wintering area is at the southern tip of South America at Tierra del Fuego. Now, for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to refer to the birds that migrate all the way to Tierra del Fuego as the long distance migrants, and these other birds as short distance migrants. The breeding grounds are in the central Canadian Arctic, and so the conservation challenges for this species start with just the vast distances that are covered during the annual cycle and the threats in such a large area. And so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Delaware Bay, then I'm going to mention 1 or 2 things about the breeding grounds, and then I'm going to show you some results from stopovers in fall stopovers on the Atlantic coast. So if there was a smoking gun for a bird population decline, it may be changes in food resources in Delaware Bay for red knots. Red knots, of course, stop in Delaware Bay to feed on the eggs of horseshoe crabs during their spawning season. And that's at the same time when these crabs are harvested for use as bait in 2 other fisheries. And they're also collected and bled for biomedical purposes. And so this bait harvest peaked in the mid to late 90s when the harvest was unregulated, and then declined as regulations were implemented. But this harvest of crabs coincided with declines in the population stopping at Delaware Bay as counted by aerial surveys. And so this correspondence between the harvest and these declines in the stopover population was considered the smoking gun, and resulted in the implementation of an adaptive harvest management program to regulate the crab harvest in a way that it's constrained by the number of red knots stopping in Delaware Bay. So I am not going to talk about the adaptive harvest management today, but I do want to tell you about the population estimation methods that we're using to estimate passage population size, and because it's something that we're doing at multiple stopover migration areas in the flyway. So this, our estimation is the result of a Jolly-Sieber superpopulation model, which is a fantastic model for studying migration areas because it has parameters for the entry probabilities that represent the proportion of the population arriving in the study area, the stopover area, each season at each time step in this model. It has parameters about the persistence of birds in the stopover area, which provide inference about length of stay and stopover duration. And then finally, with this superpopulation formulation, we get an abundance parameter, which for us, in this case, with MARC Resite data, is the number of flagged birds that pass through the stopover area. And we need additional data to estimate the total population size for marked and unmarked birds. And so the additional data come from counts of marked and unmarked birds. Observers in the field randomly check certain parts of flocks and check a certain number of birds for marks and record the number of marks in that sample. And so this M is the number of marked birds, that's data. This is the number of birds that were checked, that's also data. and we estimate this proportion of the population that's carrying marks with a simple binomial model, maybe a time-dependent version not shown here. But finally, the last step is to combine these pieces of information and adjust the number of flagged or marked birds from the Jolly-Sieber model with this proportion of the population that's marked, so that we can have an estimate of the superpopulation size or stopover population size that includes marked and unmarked birds. It accounts for turnover in the population, and it accounts for probability of resighting. So with that model and thousands of hours in the field by research crews, dedicated research crews and citizen scientists doing the mark recite work, we can make a time series of estimates like this one. And so this is passage population size for red knots in Delaware Bay from 2011 to 2019. And you can see that the population has been fairly steady at about 45,000 knots and does not bounce around a whole lot. The blue squares are aerial surveys, peak counts from aerial surveys each year, which have also been fairly steady. And so with perhaps maybe a little increase in recent years. And so it seems that the population is maybe stabilized and is perhaps in one of the bottlenecks that Steve mentioned yesterday in the declining population paradigm. It seems to be stable. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service, when they listed this subspecies under the Endangered Species Act in 2015, considered the threat to the food supply at Delaware Bay to be abated, and that was not a threat, no longer a threat, and that in fact the species was listed for concerns in other parts of the annual cycle, including the breeding grounds. And so we'll go there next. So this is a map of the breeding range from Lathrop et al. In 2018, which was a tagging and telemetry study where the tags were applied during migration and then tracked on the breeding grounds, and with nest searches and also with this habitat mapping using Maxent. And so breeding habitat seems concentrated around Southampton Island and Coates Island in north of Hudson Bay, King William Island, and Victoria Island. But there's not a lot of information about breeding ecology of this subspecies because of the difficulties of working in this part of the world. First of all, the knots nest at extremely low densities, and their nests are really hard to find. Most contemporary information about nesting ecology comes from a few nests monitored at Southampton Island, but there are severe challenges to working on the breeding grounds and getting enough information for population modeling, and that's probably not, that's going to be a very difficult thing to overcome, and this part of the annual cycle seems to be the least known about this part. So now I want to move to some fall migration studies. We've done the superpopulation approach at Mingan and Cape Cod and Georgia. Mingan in 2008 had a population of almost 10,000 birds, and they stayed for a relatively short amount of time, maybe 11 days. In Cape Cod, in a multi-year study from 2009 to 2016, it was a slightly smaller population that fluctuated from 3,000 to 8,000 knots, but was a mix of long-distance migrants and short-distance migrants, which we determined using isotope data. So these little pie charts show the proportion of long-distance migrants in blue and short-distance migrants in orange. At Cape Cod, the long-distance migrants seem to pass through early in the season and don't stay very long. The short-distance migrants headed to southeastern or southeastern U.S. and Caribbean, for example, stayed much, much longer, some 2 to 3 months, and they go through a complete flight feather molt at Cape Cod. So it's a staging and a stopover area. And in 2011, we were in Georgia, and there was a much bigger population, over 23,000 knots, and they were 90% short distance migrants. And these birds also stopped and went through a flight feather molt in a 2 or 3 month staging period. And so how we're still learning how birds use the coast and how this population structure affects conservation and management during stopover, and why long distance migrants do not molt until they get to Tierra del Fuego, whereas the short distance migrants stop on the Atlantic coast before getting to the wintering grounds and actually do molt along the way. So for knowledge gaps, I wanted to highlight a couple of things. I guess I would say seasonal survival is one of the important things that we would like to know to understand where mortality is concentrated in the annual cycle, and concentrate conservation and management there. And Paul Smith and I have talked about organizing the banders at most all of these sites in a way that we could use mark recite and multi-state mark recapture models to estimate survival and movements. Because of the challenges of working on the breeding ground, we lack information on productivity and juvenile survival, and perhaps the promise is in developing indices to productivity at fall migration areas. And Amy McDonald at Trent University, working with Erica Knoll and Paul Smith, has developed a way to integrate age ratios into the superpopulation model and has made a lot of progress there. I think I will move on in the interest of time. The management actions that we can think about implementing for red knots include this short list here. Coastal engineering is a set of practices that can have negative effects or beneficial effects. And so we need to start identifying best management practices for those and trying to reduce the negative effects and increase the beneficial uses. Given sea level rise, we're going to be working on facilitating marsh and shoreline migration for the next 10 or 20 years. And these are things that are going to impact red knots and other shorebirds. And so we could try to use those as tools, management action tools for red knots and other shorebirds. I'm going to move on to the last part of my talk, which is about this question of trying to target management for multiple species, given the number of species that are declining and the limited resources always for conservation and management. And so I think the potential here starts with a common conceptual model of how populations and management decisions go together. And so I want to just talk to you or tell you about this conceptual model from Nichols and Hines in 2002, which from a paper about estimating lambda with mark recapture approaches. But their conceptual model for understanding management actions or management decisions was a combination of elasticities, management effectiveness, and cost efficiency. Elasticities is something that Steve introduced yesterday in the declining population paradigm. What are the relative contributions of vital rates to population change? We also need information about what are the effects of management actions on those vital rates. And then finally, what are the true costs of management actions? If we want to really address bang for the buck in the multi-species approach, we need to understand cost efficiency much better. And so I'm going to show you this equation from Nichols and Hines, which combines these three ideas because it's a formal representation of bang for the buck that is really exciting. You have the elasticities here in the first part, where you have population change as a function of proportional change in a vital rate from a projection matrix. You have changes in that vital rate given the amount of a management action of type K. And then finally, you have the cost efficiency piece, which is the change in the management action given the dollar invested, given the amount of money invested. So you can see after cancellation of terms here that you have bang for the buck in terms of change of population's growth given dollar invested. So I think this is an interesting conceptual model of how to describe management actions. It also points out something that a point that Viviana made yesterday in the question and answer period, which is that even though elasticity for adult survival, say, may be the highest, depending on effectiveness of management actions and efficiency, you may have more success in increasing population growth by doing actions that are more effective and more efficient. So I will, let's see, my last slide then is about, I just wanted to point out that this Nichols and Hines approach is not the only approach available. There are similar approaches. Priority threats management is one, and project prioritization protocol is another. And I've got a couple of management scenarios here, or management settings that are going to be providing management and restoration for shorebirds, which happy to talk a little bit more about how the conceptual model might be applied in those settings. I think I'll stop there because I'm out of time, as far as I can tell, and see if there's time for questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Jim. We're going to move on to the next talk, and we'll do questions at the end in the panel discussion. I'd like to remind the audience that please put questions into the Q&A as you think of them. So when you're listening to Jim's talk and when you're listening to another talk, you can populate the Q&A with questions, and we'll come back to those questions at the end of all 4 presentations. So just so that a question, for example, for Jim doesn't get lost in that whole process. So please feel free to type into the Q&A as we go. Great. So let's move on to Orrin Robinson, who's currently a research associate at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. After earning degrees at Auburn, the University of South Alabama, and at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, and Rutgers, he's worked on a wide range of critters, publishing on Red Hills salamander conservation, human-induced mortality in sea turtles, game theory modeling of sex-changing fish conservation, effects of seabird bycatch mitigation, brown pelicans, black ducks, shorebirds, and then tricolored blackbird, which he's going to talk about in his talk. He now analyzes eBird and other data to study the distribution and demographics of species of conservation concern. And if you had to pick a bird totem, it would probably be reddish egret, and that's because they don't care how silly they look, and as long as they're catching fish. So take it away, Orrin. Orrin, you need to unmute. There you go.
All right, I think I'm unmuted now. So I'm going to talk about how we used eBird in an IPM to evaluate tricolor blackbird declines in California. All right, so the majority of tricolor blackbirds are found in California, mostly in the Central Valley. Although there have been recent observations in Washington and Oregon, there's a small, very small and declining population in northern Baja California. During the middle part of the 1900s, the population underwent a substantial decline. And when we started this project, the number that we kept coming across was a 60% decline since 2008, which was at the time based on this triennial statewide survey that they have in California. So we first, of course, looked to see what data was available to help us, estimate the decline and more importantly, try to estimate the drivers of it. What we had was a collaborator at UC Davis had banded almost 80,000 tricolor blackbirds at the time. Didn't have a ton of recaptures, And then we had some nest survey data that we could also use. So given that we had those two data sets, we wanted to use any available count data to try to put together an IPM to estimate population growth and the drivers of the population growth. So we first looked at BBS data. This is a really, really hard species for BBS. What BBS data tells us really is what we already know about the species, that they're colonial nesters and they have very low site fidelity. If a colony located near a BBS route one year, we see a spike. If there were no colonies near BBS routes, we see very few of them. And in seeing a spike in one year and seeing no birds the next year is not necessarily indicative of a decline for this species because they have such low site fidelity. They probably just went somewhere else that year. So this was very difficult to use BBS for a species like this. There is a tricolored blackbird specific survey done in California every 3 years. It's also at fixed-ish sites. New ones are added when new colonies are found. But again, it's done every 3 years. We had annual survival, annual fecundity data, so we really wanted annual counts for this model. So, of course, we decided to use eBird as our count data in the IPM with these other data sets. The eBird data was spatially and temporally filtered. We filtered to account for class imbalance. And when you do all these filtering processes, you remove a lot of data. So one of the things we also did was resampled and refiltered many, many times. And each of those data sets then went into a zero inflated GAM. So this is a two-step model that essentially asks, is it there? And if so, how many? The average yearly abundance was then used as the count data in an IPM. So for the IPM, we used a two-stage population model, again, a pre-breeding census. So we linked the demographic parameters to the relative abundance from eBird. We had the submodels for the fecundity and survival data. You can see the linked parameters across submodels in red here. So it's a relatively straightforward IPM. Some results from this. I'll pause for everybody to gasp. Tricolored blackbirds have declined. We found that there was a 34% decline roughly over the 10 years of the study. Not the 60% decline that we kept coming across, but still a very substantial decline. A third of the population has been lost in 10 years. Again, this is not surprising to anyone in California that there has been this decline of tricolored blackbirds. We were more interested in what may be causing these declines. So female adult survival here was the top vital rate associated with growth. Fecundity was second, only slightly less important. And I want to borrow from Steve's talk. This is where the sensible sensitivity comes into play. Adult survival is already pretty high. So you're not going to move it with any management. Fecundity being somewhat low then becomes a prime target for management action. So that would be the recommendation from a study like this, where conservation actions aimed at improving fecundity would be the recommendation. And that kind of goes along with what they were already doing in California as far as trying to protect nests of tricolor blackbirds in agricultural fields. So we wanted to take this a little bit further and see what would happen if we analyzed just the banding data on its own, or analyzed the IPM as separate populations in the north and the south. And I apologize to any Californian who hates my definition of Southern California here. So looking at just the banding data alone, we see similar results in survival to the IPM. The IPM estimates are in white, the banding data alone in black. This is not surprising. It's the same banding data that went into the IPM. We see that analyzing the banding data on its own really shows that you cannot pick up a trend when you just look at the banding data. If you focus on the mean population change, you could potentially make the very, very flimsy argument that the population is possibly stable. But given the wide credible intervals, I would not make that argument. The most interesting thing that came out of the banding data alone analysis is that there is a lot of movement from the south to the north across years. And there's a whole world of weeds we can get into about temporary or permanent immigration and how that affects results from these models. And all of that detail is in the paper. But, you know, ultimately the birds that were banded survived and were caught again in subsequent years. So we removed within year recaptures, showed a very strong preference to move from south to north and very little in the other direction. So this is not necessarily a balanced exchange population here. Looking at the IPM, so we analyzed the northern part of California separately from the southern part of California, and wanted to just look at the IPM from a regional perspective. The main change we made to the IPM for this analysis was that we allowed movement between the regions in the form of an immigration parameter in the IPMs. So for the South population, we see this incredible decline, roughly 52% decline over the 10 years of the study. This is much larger than what we saw with the statewide population analysis. In the north, there may be a small decline that we pick up here, but it's very difficult to say with a lot of confidence that there has been a decline in the north. What we found when we considered immigration then in these populations is that the yearly contribution to the observed number of tricolor blackbirds is roughly 7 relative birds. Again, we're working with eBird data, so we're looking at relative abundance rather than some absolute number. If we look at the figure on the left, the population trajectory across the 10 years of the study, we see that the relative abundance bounces around 60 or so. So on the right is the distribution of birds added by immigration, or relative birds added by immigration. And again, that's roughly 7 birds added to a population that bounces around 60. That's, 10+% of the population that is made up of immigrants. So you can imagine the South, we see the exact opposite, where we lose a very large portion of the population due to immigrants. And this seems to also match what we saw with when analyzing the banding data alone, and that is strong northward movement of tricolored blackbirds. So this just kind of shows the proportion added or subtracted as migrants in each of the north and south populations. So to kind of conclude this, we showed that tricolor blackbirds have declined statewide by about 34% in the last 10 years, probably because of low fecundity. If you are just working in the north, the population may appear stable, but that's only because of the influx of migrants coming from the south. Whereas the south population is declining very, very rapidly. But a lot of this may be movement out of that, Southern California region and into the north, right? There are a lot of other factors in South or Southern California that may be causing them to move or causing low fecundity. But, it's not as bad as it seems in the South. All the birds are not dying. They might, a large percentage of them are probably just moving. So I want to acknowledge a lot of people who worked on this project with us. And if there are time for questions, be happy to try to answer them.
Thanks, Oren. I think because we're close to the next speaker's time, we'll just move forward and we'll come back to questions. People are typing questions into the Q&A. I see that. So we'll come back to questions as a whole panel. So thanks for your presentation. That's great. We're going to move on. Clark Rushing is the next presenter. He's going to be talking about regional variation and the importance of breeding and non-breeding habitat loss and the declining migratory songbird that you see now pictured on the screen. Clark received his PhD in ecology from the University of Maryland and his BS in ecology and evolutionary biology from Princeton. He's now an assistant professor at Utah State University. And prior to Utah State University, he was a postdoc fellow at the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center and the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. His research at Utah focuses primarily on understanding how processes operating across the annual cycle influence the population dynamics of migratory birds. In his spare time, he enjoys hiking, fishing, and watching the Atlanta Braves beat up on the New York Mets. I'd also have to tell you that Clark really loves facilitators teaching him how to sing the wood thrush song at quarter speed as part of a choir.
Yeah, my only condition for participating was that we didn't have to do that this time.
All right, Clark.
Okay, so thanks everybody. So I'm gonna talk today about some work that I did while I was a postdoc with Pete Mera at the Migratory Bird Center. So this is work that was done in collaboration with Pete. I want to acknowledge Brant Ryder. He played a big role in this, and other folks at the Smithsonian, Scott Sillett as well. So this project the focus was on wood thrush. And one of the reasons we chose wood thrush for this project was because for a long time, it's been viewed as kind of a poster child of the decline of migratory birds, particularly species that breed in eastern deciduous forests. So like a lot of species in those habitats, wood thrush have shown these long-term sustained declines of, in the case of wood thrush, close to 2% per year based on BBS estimates. So that's a total loss of close to 60% of the wood thrush population over the BBS time period. And so the focus of this project was trying to understand what's driving that decline. As has come up several times over the past 2 days, including Oren's talk previously, when we talk about declines at the species level, oftentimes we're ignoring pretty substantial regional variation in the rate of population decline. So that 2% decline is not, really the whole story. This is a map. This is basically straight off of the BBS website showing spatial variation in the rate of decline across the wood thrush breeding range. So areas in red are declining much faster than 2% per year. And there's a lot of areas of red on here. But then there's other areas in yellow that are relatively stable, and areas of blue that are actually increasing, right? So we can see that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to think of the causes of declines of wood thrush happening at the species level. Instead, we need to be thinking at a smaller unit of sort of populations. But that presents an immediate problem that we had to grapple with quite a bit on this project, which is what is that population unit that we're going to focus on for our analysis? And you know, a lot of times the sort of default is to use state boundaries or bird conservation regions. So here's a map of bird conservation regions kind of overlaid on top of that wood thrush decline map. And the problem is that those boundaries are essentially arbitrary with regard to wood thrush populations and demography. So you can see that if we used BCRs as the way to define population units, we'd be within each of those BCRs sort of averaging over a lot of variation. So within a BCR, we might have increasing areas and decreasing areas. And so we might not be able to really detect a strong signal of what's driving population trends if we use these boundaries. But it turns out there's not a lot of good alternatives. There's genetic approaches, which are being highlighted by projects like the Bird Genoscape project, but we didn't really have access to good genetic data. And so we thought a lot about how we could sort of define population units based on demographic data that we had on wood thrush. And so I'll skip over a lot of the details, but essentially what we did is take all of these breeding bird survey routes that detect wood thrush and estimate at the root level both the number of wood thrush that are counted on average as well as the rate of change in those counts over time. So we have these root level estimates of abundance and trend, and then we use this kind of spatial clustering algorithm that grouped roots based on not just their proximity, because we expect roots that are closer together to be more likely part of the same population unit, but also how similar those roots were in terms of the abundance of wood thrush and the rate of decline. And so basically this is kind of what the clustering algorithm spits out. So these, the tip of each of these, of this tree, those are individual BBS roots. And then this clustering algorithm has sort of grouped them based on how close they are together in space and how similar they are in trend and abundance. And this gives us a way to sort of think about population units that are based on what we see in terms of population dynamics rather than artificial boundaries. Those trees aren't very helpful for sort of visualizing what's happening here. So this is a map. It's hard to come up with a good color palette for 17 populations, but this is basically, the map is showing just convex hulls plotted around the BBS roots in each of those populations. And then each little figure here shows the estimated change in abundance over time for those populations. And you can see we are pulling out a lot of that variation. So we have some populations that are high abundance and stable, like this purple population down at the bottom right. We have populations that are stable but very low abundance, like that red population up at the top left. And then we have some that are declining quite rapidly. So particularly in the Northeast and the Southeast, we see these populations that historically have had very high numbers of wood thrush. These are sort of core populations, but they're declining very quickly. So they're sort of rapidly approaching, low abundance status. So if we were to apply that half-life analysis that Ken talked about yesterday, we'd see some of these populations probably actually have pretty long half-lives, much larger than sort of average for this species. And some of them have very short half-lives because they're declining so quickly. So this gave us sort of a way to think about population units in a demographic way that we could then go a little bit deeper into trying to understand what's driving this regional variation in population declines. And this sort of touches on a point Steve made yesterday, which is that one of the ways we can learn about what's driving declines in some of these smoking guns is through sort of comparative work among these populations. So using each of these as sort of a replicate to look at what might be driving declines, and in that way learn about what's important. So for a species like wood thrush, of course, loss of forested habitat on the breeding grounds is potentially a problem. So this is a remote sense data set looking at forest cover and forest loss, I think from year 2000 to 2012. So you can see some of these wood thrush populations have lost a substantial amount of potential habitat on the breeding grounds, particularly these populations in the southeast and up in kind of the northeast part of the range. As has come up a lot in this conference, and as we're all probably aware, wood thrush spend 8 months of the year probably on their wintering grounds in Central America, where they're also experiencing pretty rapid rates of forest loss. So in this analysis, what we did is we took the wood thrush winter range in Mexico and Central America, divided it up into 5 regions, I should say. This is not based on demography. And then we used that same remote sensing data set to look at annual rates of forest loss. So the top right graph here is annual forest loss, or excuse me, annual forest cover in each of those 5 regions. And you can see, again, a lot of heterogeneity. So parts of Mexico, Nicaragua, have lost, upwards of 12, 13, 14% of their forest cover just over this 12-year period. Other regions like Panama and Costa Rica have not lost quite as much, but all of these regions have lost winter habitat. And we know from a lot of work that it's not just habitat loss, but also climate that can drive population dynamics of migratory birds. So in this analysis, we also used remote sensed EVI values. So that's like NDVI, it's a measure of greenness on the wintering grounds as another potential driver of population dynamics on the breeding grounds. So the bottom left graph here shows annual values of that EVI index for each of those 5 non-breeding regions with kind of the trend overlaid on top. And you can see most of these regions they haven't experienced sort of directional changes in climate, even though there's a lot of variation from one year to the next. But this region of sort of southern Mexico, the blue region, does look like overall it has experienced kind of a decline in habitat quality as measured by EVI. So this provides a lot of potential drivers of wood thrush population dynamics: habitat loss on the breeding grounds, habitat loss on the wintering grounds, climate on the wintering grounds. We also included climate on the breeding grounds. And so the challenge here is to kind of put that all together in a modeling framework that allows us to test at the population level what might be driving population decline. So this is the only math I'll put in this presentation. This is essentially just the Link and Sauer model that many of you are probably familiar with. It's been used for a long time to quantify rates of population declines based on BBS data. It's essentially just a big regression model. So we took that basic Link and Sauer model and added these covariates, the amount of habitat loss the previous year on the breeding grounds, amount of habitat loss for linked winter regions. So we use migratory connectivity data to kind of link breeding populations to winter regions, and then habitat loss. So we're modeling counts at the level of a BBS route, but we're measuring, this is a hierarchical model, so we're measuring these coefficients at the population level. And essentially what we're asking is, do year-to-year fluctuations in wood thrush numbers, are those associated with change in habitat loss on the breeding grounds or the wintering grounds or those climate covariates? I can talk more about that if people have questions. So just to highlight some of the results. So each of these graphs here, the red dots is a standardized measure of wood thrush abundance in 5 of these breeding populations over the study period as a function of forest loss in the previous year in this kind of central winter region in Central America, where we know a lot of wood thrush spend the winter. And for all 5 of these populations, we found this strong negative relationship between wood thrush abundance in one year and non-breeding habitat loss in the previous year. So the red line there is kind of the estimated relationship from that model. And so this means that if you lose a lot of habitat in the wintering region, the next year you see fewer wood thrush show up on the breeding ground in these populations. One of the things that's kind of interesting about this is that those 5 populations are, really kind of the core of the wood thrush breeding range. These are high abundance wood thrush populations right in the middle of the breeding range. And so this is sort of consistent with the idea that habitat-driven changes are driving dynamics in these core populations, possibly through kind of density dependent processes. Another thing to highlight here is that for at least a few of the populations, we found a strong relationship between climate on the wintering grounds and abundance the next year on the breeding grounds. So these are the same figures, but the x-axis now is that EVI value from this region, the southern Mexico winter region. So this is a positive relationship, meaning that when we see a greener year on the non-breeding grounds, more wood thrush show up the next year on the breeding grounds. If you remember back a few slides, this region of southern Mexico is kind of the only one that appears to be experiencing a decline in climate-driven habitat quality. So this is potentially a little bit alarming for these populations that the abundance seems to be driven by non-breeding climate. It suggests that climate change on the wintering grounds could be a possible driver of declines we see on the breeding grounds. And again, these are sort of peripheral populations. So this is consistent with the idea that peripheral populations where abundance is lower, the dynamics might be more driven by density independent factors like climate, as opposed to the availability of habitat. The last kind of result from this analysis that I'll show, we did sort of a post hoc look at the overall rate of decline in each of these 17 populations. So each dot here is one of those 17 populations. The y-axis shows the rate of decline over this entire study period. And then the x-axis is the net loss of breeding habitat over that same time period. And you can see there's a lot of variation, but we do see at least an indication that the populations that have lost the most breeding habitat are on average declining faster than the populations that have lost less breeding habitat, which suggests that breeding habitat is probably playing a role in the steepest declines that we see. I won't talk about what the colors of these dots mean in this context, but I can answer that question later. So just to kind of wrap up what we found with this study, habitat loss, both on the breeding and the non-breeding grounds, and climate appear to limit populations of wood thrush, but the strength of those effects is not the same across the breeding range. So we found at least some evidence that these core populations of high abundance habitat appear to be more limited by the availability of habitat, possibly due to density dependence, whereas the peripheral populations appear to be more limited by climate, perhaps through density independence. I wanted to just quickly reiterate a point that Scott Boomer made earlier about some of these types of analyses, which is, I think instead of thinking of this as really strong evidence of limitation, these results provide a good way to develop hypotheses, right? This gives us a way to sort of move forward with a hypothesis about how population limitation might occur, but we need more work to sort of strengthen those inferences. We also, in the paper, if you go look at it, did sort of a back of the envelope calculation where we found that the breeding habitat loss for a given amount of habitat, the loss of breeding habitat has about 3 to 6 times more effect on population abundance than the same amount of non-breeding habitat loss, potentially suggesting that, you know, if you just take it on an acre by acre basis, breeding habitat is more limiting than winter habitat. So with that, I'll wrap up, just re-acknowledging the people that helped with these analyses, and if there's time, I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, thanks. Again, we'll, there are a lot of questions rolling in for individual presenters, but we'll take those at, you know, at the panel. Thanks, Clark. I want to give the floor now to Hannah Nevins. Hannah is a Seabird Program Director with the American Bird Conservancy, and she's worked for more than 20 years in seabird research and conservation. Her research is focused on understanding, quantifying, and addressing threats to seabirds, in particular plastics, oil spills, fisheries bycatch. Her conservation work is focused on migratory seabird colony restoration and protection, and she has led the ABC Seabird Program since 2014, working to protect and restore seabirds across the Americas by addressing their most significant threats on land and at sea through developing partnerships, innovative partnerships, and direct actions. So thank you very much, Hannah, and take it away. You need to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Tom. And I feel really grateful to be part of this group. And thanks also to Pete and Ken for including seabirds. And so today I'd like to take a little bit of time to just show you some examples from a totally different environment and give you some case studies. And if grassland birds are the, you know, bellwethers of the terrestrial North American landscape, then seabirds like this black-footed albatross here are really the indicators of long-term basin-wide changes to the marine seascape. So clearly seabirds are in decline, and this was recognized early on by John Croxall and others, and that, you know, nearly a third of the world's seabirds are threatened or endangered. And Polanski did a recent summary suggesting that of the monitored population, 70% are in decline. So these are real strong indicators that something's happening at a large scale in the marine environment as well. And where are the smoking guns? I think, as Pete pointed out earlier, we have to think about how we got here historically and where the legacy are. In the US Pacific Islands, there was a legacy of guano mining, millinery harvest, and what I would consider over-exploitation, that is the vast accumulation of resources from those islands, leaving a legacy of introduced mammalian predators, which impacted these ground nesting birds. More modern threats include things that are associated with human development, and emerging threats include those of increasing frequency and intensity of climate-induced impacts to marine ecosystems through bottom-up approaches, and things like sea level rise, which inundate island ecosystems. So I'm not going to go into great detail on all of these, but there's a plethora of threats for these birds as they traverse the oceans. So in terms of a road to recovery, what works? And we know in fisheries, there's two kind of ways we can approach this problem: reducing fishery impacts through their, mitigation of their direct impact on seabirds, that is fisheries bycatch, getting hooked, entangled, or drowned in nets. Or there's those indirect effects. And there's a nice paper by Curie recently on leaving 1/3 for the birds. So reducing our impacts on their food. But today I want to really focus on the colony restoration work because I think it does really show us some highlights, some positive studies on how we can protect, enhance, and create new breeding colonies for these birds. And as was pointed out by Clark, that there really is more bang for your buck in places where birds are aggregated and where you're having your effect on the most vulnerable or sensitive life stages. So this is an example from my backyard. This is what recovery looks like for a coastal seabird. And this is a common murre here, a diving bird susceptible to oil spills and gillnet fisheries. And this little colony here, Devil Slide Rock, is a great example to use as, this colony was about 2,500 birds that was essentially extirpated by one single oil spill in the vicinity of the colony. And nearly 10 years later, after a colony restoration plan was put into place through mitigation and funding for that work, restoration began and social attraction was used to bring birds back to this little rock. So social attraction is a technique that's been used in the seabird world, including decoys, calls, and mirrors. So there's little playback systems in these little boxes here with the mirrors and places for birds to come in and socialize with the decoys and feel comfortable. And this resulted in this increase in productivity and attendance and overall recovery at that site. And this technique of colony restoration has been used now worldwide. And Steve Kress was really one of the grandfathers of work in the restoration technology and techniques. And it was really championed by David Towns and other New Zealanders and promoted through an ad hoc group of scientists, academics, and conservationists in the Pacific Seabird Group, and expanded to islands in Mexico, Alaska, Hawaii, the Caribbean, and South America through various initiatives. And many of these have been supported through mitigation funds. I want to highlight the work in the Pacific Mexican islands off of Baja, California as a great example of how this can work. Many of these islands had invasive mammalian predators, and you can imagine the impacts to very vulnerable ground nesting seabirds such as the Guadalupe merlet pictured here. Now the group that's been leading this effort in Mexico, Grupo Ecologia y Conservación de las Islas, is really showing that you can scale up this colony restoration work. And Juliana has a chapter in the Island Invasive Symposium on this. It looks like I might be losing my bandwidth here. I'm gonna stop my video. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
You're good.
Hear me there?
We're not hearing you now, Hannah.
Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Okay. So now, how do we do this work? We move from the coast into a more open pelagic system. And what does recovery look like for a more pelagic seabird? So I'm taking the Hawaiian petrel here. And this is the bird while it's chick provisioning, feeding in the North Pacific, and its breeding areas are in the main Hawaiian Islands here in the Central Pacific. So making huge journeys away from the colony site and back to the same nesting hole year after year. Next slide. So the Hawaiian petrel, or Oahu, nests in mountainous colonies on 5 of the main 8 islands, and there is some genetic structuring among the population, but I'm not going to talk about that too much today. They are highly vulnerable in they nest underground, laying 1 egg per year. They're very long-lived and monogamous, and the age of first reproduction is 5 to 7 years, and those life history tactics really put them in a different place relative to terrestrial birds. So what are some of the key elements of the petrel recovery blueprint that's been promoted by the Kauai Endangered Seabird Recovery Project? One is just define the nests, identify threats at those nests, and then protection of sites. And again, in this case, invasive predators are a key threat here, affecting every nest site on the island of Kauai. So methods that are used include marine radar to detect nocturnally flying birds up into the flyways. And this map here on the left shows targets of birds coming into flyways. Song meters, such as this wildlife acoustics song meter, have been used to detect activity in breeding areas, and then ground searching to find the nests is a key element of their tactic in this area. And in the case of the Hawaiian petrel, for some of these areas, it was 3 to 5 years to really get enough nests to actually monitor and establish a program. So it takes a lot of time and effort. So finding nests and monitoring them with remote cameras is a key tool. And as you can see, these fluffy bundles of fat, they're 400 to 500 grams. They weigh more than the adult by the time they're fledging, are highly vulnerable to nest predators. In situ protection at nests is a key tactic, and this can happen in a variety of ways. One has been to design these predator-proof fencing designs, and this is an example from Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, where they've protected their nest sites with a predator-proof fence. Or it can happen through predator control at nest sites with more traditional traps and fences. And there's a pig fence in the background of this photo. We've also employed the use of good nature traps, which are automatic resetting rodent traps, which has been a real boon for the conservation community in islands because of the ubiquitous nature of this egg predator, and also the fact that you don't have to have people in the field. And even with all the trapping and protection, these methods aren't completely effective. And here's a photo of a cat taking an adult petrel from its nest and walking right by a trap. So predator protection works. Let's get to the next slide. But ensuring greater long-term protection via fencing and increasing the attractiveness via social attraction has been a more active form of management that we've undertaken. And this is led by Pacific Rim Conservation in partnership with the National Wildlife Refuge at Kilauea Point, the Nihoku Restoration Site. And the idea here is that you create a new site that is free from predators with a fence, and then attract them to the site and provide artificial burrows so that they're able to find a home immediately. And then another layer on this active management includes moving or translocating chicks to imprint at the new site. And again, this increased your costs with aviculturists involved and veterinarians, and it may increase the time until you see recovery, but it certainly increases the expense as well. And to date at the Nihoku Restoration Site, we've had really good success in fledging both Hawaiian petrels and Newell shearwaters. This is a long-term project, and we're hoping we're a year 6 that we'll get some birds in the coming years to resume breeding there. So can we take the same approach to improve other species like black-cap petrel conservation? And with black-cap petrels, this is a Caribbean endemic that comes and winters off the east coast of the US. There's extremely limited resources, limited capacity, and complex political and economic landscapes in which these birds are nesting. And so I've been involved with the International Black-Cap Petrel Conservation Group, and this is a group of both on-the-ground biologists, scientists, experts, to come together to look at how we can use what we know about petrel ecology and use a new tool developed by the folks at UC Santa Cruz, with Tim Tinker being the main modeler, to try to inform some of our conservation decisions. And there's a real urgency for understanding threats to this species. It's declining and there's emerging threats. So offshore wind is proposed off the East Coast, expanding, and predators are at all known nesting sites. So we also have a huge amount of uncertainty about where these birds breed. The only confirmed nesting sites are within Hispaniola and Haiti and the DR, and all of those have nest predators present. But there's suspected sites in the Lesser Antilles, particularly in Dominica, and sightings in Cuba, and questionable historic information from other sites like Jamaica. So we tried to use the model as this sort of crystal ball, and I'm not the modeler, so I'm just a ecologist and biologist trying to figure out if this can help us as a tool in our conservation planning. And so we came up with a generalized petrel life cycle, and I think the main takeaway is that adult survivorship is very high, and time at the nest site is prolonged. So we have, 100 to 140 days at the nest site. And here's our first run of our model outcomes. And you can see that status quo is not good. The predators are still winning and the petrels are losing. And so I think that's, for me, one of the big takeaways is in the next 50 to 100 years, that's our time frame of this projection here, the abundance will continue to decrease. Whereas if we start to initiate in situ protection and find some additional nests, we can increase that resilience and slow the rate of decline. And that maybe options such as active translocation may help buffer the decline in the long term. So we're just at the initial phases of this, and I appreciate any feedback and further discussion about this species. So I'll leave with this. For seabirds, the road to recovery can start with colony restoration, and that we need all the on-the-ground actions, but we also need those critical actions to happen in the collaborative arena as well. Creating region-wide planning documents, fostering these partnerships, refining the threat and risk models, and building the funding sources from a variety of sources. So with that, I will thank you. And I'm sure I'm out of time here.
All right, thanks. Thanks so much, Hannah. We're going to move into a panelist mode now. So I'm going to make everybody's, ask the panelists who are on the last 5 presenters, including Scott, to make their videos available. I have a couple specific questions that have come up for individuals. And I'm going to save Some of these are sort of more general, and if other folks want to chime in on a question, please do so. So the question is, if competition among bird species during the breeding season is playing a role in determining abundance of individual species, might that be detectable by looking for spatial variation in covariation in species abundance? For example, as wood thrush numbers decline, are there other species that are increasing across the range? Can we relate movements in one species to another? And I guess this comes mostly to Clark.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I haven't seen any real examples of that. And I think in theory it could work. I think you could use kind of BBS type analyses to do that. I think it depends on sort of the underlying ecology, if that's really something that is driving dynamics of these species, which I'm not positive or not.
Right, I think that maybe in certain systems like the barred owl, spotted owl system, or maybe some of the raven land bird systems, that might be a little, where the direct, but that's more like, well, I guess that kind of thing. But in the system that you studied, nothing's apparent.
Yeah, no, not that I'm aware of. I think, yeah, it depends on you probably need pretty strong underlying sort of ecological interactions to be able to see that show up in the BBS data, which is gonna, I don't know for species like wood thrush what those interactions would be off the top of my head.
Here's a specific question, I think, for Jim. Jim, is as far as we know, do you have any idea of the flight altitude of fall migrants off the Northeast Atlantic coast from tracking data? And for example, could it be a case that offshore wind energy would be a concern for these migrants?
Yeah, I don't have a great knowledge of flight altitudes during fall migration, but I am aware of some work trying to evaluate the potential for impacts from wind energy development on the Atlantic coast. And that's work by Joanna Berger and her colleagues, who used some different tracking technologies. I think it was a combination of geolocators and radios to look at movements, not necessarily during migration, but maybe a little bit more during winter and throughout the annual cycle. And one of the take homes from that work that I remember was that red knots actually spend a bigger part of the year along the Atlantic coast during the non-breeding season than we really were aware of. And so I think there is concern for the impacts of offshore wind energy development. And I would say that Joanna Berger's work is the first look at that.
Okay, thanks. This is a question for Oren. It is well known that reproductive success in tricolored blackbirds is an issue given colonies and grain crops are regularly mowed during harvest. As you know, management actions are being taken to purchase crops where they're nesting each year in order to protect them. How might your work, current or upcoming, help refine or modify that management strategy or point to other management strategies? You need to unmute, Oren.
Yeah, that's the second time I've done that today. Yeah, so I know in the last few years that it has been a thing where these blackbird colonies prefer to, or like to nest in triticale fields, which is grown for dairy cattle. And sometimes the harvesting of those fields coincides with the blackbird colonies breeding there, and that just destroys all the nests. I think the current work that we're doing, honestly, I know this sounds like a cop-out, but honestly, it brings up another question of management, and that is if they are moving from south to north, and we think this is a continuous, potential shift of more birds moving from south to north. Do we continue spending those dollars in the south region versus look at where they're going? I think that's kind of what our current work is asking, really.
So, okay, thanks. This is a question from Bill Vermillion, and it's kind of works off that question into some of the other points that speakers were making. And I'm not sure how any of you can answer this, but here we go. Will there be a consideration of feasibility or the economic efficiency during the process of identifying species limiting factors and how to address them for science? Or will that be a responsibility and decision of conservation organizations and agencies as they attempt to arrest population declines? In other words, how do we build in this economic efficiency feasibility factor as we develop strategies to address declines or even to investigate them? And I think that's one for anybody.
Well, I'll just say for the seabirds, a lot of it has fallen on the NGOs and private foundations to support a lot of this work. So the Packard Foundation and the NIFWIF have programs for marine birds specifically, but there isn't a equivalent sort of federal initiative from Fish and Wildlife that really takes on the conservation and recovery as a whole-scale taxonomic group. I may be wrong, but that's my understanding of where we're at right now.
Any comments from the other panelists in terms of where that economic analysis, where it's sort of best inserted or how to approach it?
Yeah, I would add, Tom, that something that I was meaning to say about that metric that I showed and how it could be used with multiple species. That is the formulation that I showed was for the effects of management actions on one vital rate. But Nichols and Hines in the paper describe how you could calculate that for multiple vital rates, all the vital rates in a projection matrix, and sum them so that the metric refers to all the vital rates for a species. And so I would say, I think that means that you could do the same thing for multiple species by adding them up across species, whether it's for one vital rate or all of the vital rates. And in that way, the metric becomes this multi-species measure of the management effectiveness of different management actions. And you could use that in a decision-making framework as a way to identify the smartest thing to do. That's not quite, and there's another part to the question, I think, that was about the prioritization of species or identification of limiting threats. That's a little bit different, but glad to have the opportunity to mention how, how that metric that I showed maybe could be moved towards a multiple species kind of thing.
Great. So panelists, you can feel free to unmute yourselves as needed. But so here's a question I guess I'm going to ask everybody. Because we had such a range of insights coming from such a range of examples from, talks focusing on very specific management actions to looking at just where threats might be in the life cycle and so on. A lot of different approaches, a tremendous amount of material to process. But my question is going to be for each of you, what was a critical point in your interaction with the process where you had some insight that you feel changed the direction of your approach? Or perhaps another way to ask that question is, what was your number one lesson learned? What would you do differently if you were to start the whole analysis and recovery process from scratch? What would be that single insight or that single lesson that would change the way you might have approached things?
I can go first. Speaking about tricolor blackbirds, the one piece of information that we would love to have is tracking information. These things move around so much that trying to understand where they're going would really help us tease apart a lot of the things that we're trying to estimate in these models. So for me, that would be the one piece that I think is missing. That, if you said you could start over and have anything, that would be it.
Yeah, that's exactly the question.
So I'll add and maybe mention a little bit more context to this wood thrush project. So we had a paper that came out that I didn't talk about today that was more of a in-depth mechanistic look at drivers of population dynamics using an integrated population model. And so kind of this whole wood thrush project spanned this kind of large scale analysis using BBS data, as well as this very data intensive IPM framework. And, one of the things that became quite clear to me is that those are sort of complementary, that these integrated population models, which are kind of all the rage these days and people are really excited about. Scott did a great job giving an overview of that modeling approach, kind of the full annual cycle approach for ducks. And, we talked about data envy. Those IPMs take a lot of data to implement, even with some of the ideas that Scott mentioned in terms of priors and expert elicitation. So they're really great for getting these very mechanistic insights into what's driving population dynamics, but they're very data intensive. And so, I think scaling those to the taxonomic and geographic scales that we're talking about, we're a long way off from being able to do that. But these kind of less data intensive approaches where we have BBS data and eBird data can be very complementary, I think, in terms of looking at temporal and spatial scales that we're a long way off in these IPMs. And so we should sort of be thinking about these approaches in terms of not just should we all be focused on IPMs, but which of these different analytical techniques can give us the information we need to move forward.
Any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think, we used a totally different model approach with this stage structured sort of Caswell approach with the seabird PVA model. Because it's seabirds, we don't have the breeding bird survey, we don't have any map stations, we don't have those same data sets and data sources. So we're kind of flying a little bit more blind, but I think one of the key eye-openers with that is that we can build these more general models and continue to refine them by testing the parts of it. What do we need to know? What's a key parameter, and our assumptions behind kind of these general models are really important. And so, yeah, I guess I would add that.
So Scott, how about you? I mean, you're working with what we in the non-game world think of as the Cadillac of approaches. What if you were approaching waterfowl management and habitat management for waterfowl from scratch? What would be different in the way things are done, if anything?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think one of the things that we quickly realized with these workshops for these case studies is that facilitation mattered. I mean, we scheduled throughout the regions workshops to get input from experts. And what I quickly realized is that as biologists are apt to do, everyone wanted to quickly get to the details, and they had all their data sets and they were ready to hit the ground running. And we quickly got into the weeds so, fast that we were kind of losing our overall, focus for what the big picture was. And so, in hindsight, for some of these workshops and the development of these decision-making frameworks, more time put up front examining the big picture and, doing the actual hard problem framing would have been much more efficient, because we kind of continued to get wrapped around the axle with biological details that everyone thought were important, but it didn't lead us to where we needed to go. On the heels of that effort, I started talking to folks who have a lot of experience with structured decision making, and they reiterated that, rapid prototyping might be a more efficient way to go, where you go through all the elements of an STM process with the expectation that you're going to revisit it. And I don't necessarily think we did that, at least for the pintail example. So, bigger picture stuff was very important for bounding the problem and allowing us to make traction with, the real modeling work we had to do.
So this may be too tough a question to pull out of the air for you, Scott, or possibly for Jim, but can you give us an example of, in a really tangible way, what we mean by problem framing, or those problem sideboards, where, and I'm looking for an example where, oh, this was the wrong framing and led us down a path that maybe might not have been as effective had we framed the problem in this way. So what does that problem framing mean exactly in a kind of example?
I'll take a stab at it first, Jim. In this SDM lexicon, the problem framing essentially sets the baseline parameters, governance structures, legal mandates, spatiotemporal scales, the big things that sort of everyone has to agree on. So when you get folks together, everyone has to be on that same page. So for example, if you have differences of opinion about the spatiotemporal scales, which you think you need to mine the existing data or to represent a particular process, you can quickly speak across purposes. Some folks will say, well, I think this region in the boreal forest is most important, and they go on that assumption, whereas someone else will say, no, I think the prairie pothole region is most important. And yet you haven't framed up what actually is the spatial designation of the population of interest. And so, I usually think about time and space, governance, mandates, as well as, broad scale objectives to at least get everyone on the same page so we know what we're trying to tackle. And also with some notion of what the actual decision problem is. Is it resource allocation? Is it a straightforward optimization? Is it multi-criteria, multi-decision analyses, that kind of thing. Jim.
Right. Yeah, no, that's great, Scott. The only thing I could try to add is that in that discussion of the decision maker and the decision point and the bounds and time and space and all of that is also what are the management actions that are available to the decision maker? What are the things that you can do, right? And so my specific example, or the reason I'm thinking about that, is related to the adaptive harvest management for horseshoe crabs in Delaware Bay, the red knot horseshoe crab problem. In that problem, the decision maker is the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. And their decision is about how many crabs should we harvest each year. And there are complicated models about integrating crab popular projection models with red knot projection models and identifying the harvest package that's the smartest thing to do given horseshoe crab and red knot levels each year. But this thing that's come up a couple of different times in conversations with that group and with stakeholders is, why are we not talking about habitat restoration around Delaware Bay, or reducing disturbance on beaches around Delaware Bay? And the answer is because our frame of our problem and our decision maker is the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. And they have no jurisdiction about habitat manipulations or disturbance management, right? So those things are outside of the frame of adaptive harvest management for horseshoe crabs in Delaware Bay. If you could frame the problem differently and say, frame it from the perspective of recovery of red knots, and then you would include additional objectives about reducing harvest, but also the habitat management and the disturbance management. You would put all of those things in this new frame, and you would have a lot of different new actions available to you. So I'm trying to describe the difference between a problem frame that includes just a harvest decision and a problem frame that includes much bigger decision context, maybe with multiple decision makers. That's problem framing.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great answer. Thanks. That's really helpful. You know, we could talk for hours, days, about all this stuff, but I think since we're talking about where to go, let's move on to the next part of the program, which is to bring up Pete Mara and Ken Rosenberg to help us sort of think about where we go next, what the next steps would be, what the future looks like for the road to recovery. So Pete, I'm going to turn it over to you at this point, and I guess we can move back into the. We'll have you and Ken both be available by video and audio.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Everyone hear me okay? Great. Thanks. So I want to thank everyone. This has been very stimulating 2 days of discussions and talks, really fascinating work, both theory, empirical examples to look at, you know, how we think about limiting factors, how we reverse declines, how we manage populations from a game species perspective, or how we look at limiting factors even from a non-game species perspective. It's always amazing when we do this sort of thing, how much we really do know and how much we can apply that knowledge moving forward. So thank you to everyone for participating these last 2 days. The bad news is I'm hoping to suck you all into, Tom and Ken and I and others, to suck you into a much bigger process moving forward. But before I describe that process, I want to also acknowledge Tom Will for all the time he's put into helping to organize this effort and doing such a great job with facilitation. So we should all give Tom a virtual big applause. I wish I had a applause meter I could throw out there. So I just want to sort of wrap up a little bit with more on sort of the vision and the problem. To me, and I think to Ken and to Tom and hopefully to others, the big take-home message from the science paper and that we're trying to get across here is that what we've been doing in bird conservation doesn't appear to be working. In fact, I would say it's not working for whatever reason. I'm not pointing fingers, but it's just not working. I mean, that's the message, and we've got to do something about that. The stated goal that we've all been living by, I remember talking about this in Manomet at a bird conference a long time ago, probably 1989, I guess that conference was this idea of trying to keep common species common. And it's become sort of the motto of Partners in Flight. And we're failing, I'm failing, we're all failing at keeping common species common. That was another big message of the science paper, that's what we have to do. And folks, we're just not doing it. I mean, just look at the data. The science paper clearly demonstrates that. But we also need to remember that other species are continuing to remain in trouble. And so we have a crisis. We have a bird crisis that we have to do something about. It falls on our shoulders. We have to be held accountable for the recovery of these species. We have to move in that direction. We are witness to this. So this forces us to do some soul searching. I've done lots of soul searching about what my priorities are and how we do this work. But we have to reevaluate what we're doing to protect species, how we do that process, what species we protect. And I'm not saying it's, you know, just the common species, but it has to be all species. And it's, to me, most immediately, that's the ones that are becoming more and more rare, that it's not necessarily the common ones that are declining that we have to prioritize. But we have to really focus on those ones that are slipping closer and closer to endangered species or threatened or endangered species status. I'm not suggesting that we not also deal with broad scale threats. We've got to do that too, but doing that approach by itself is clearly not sufficient. So as a first step, it means determining what species need our help the most using objective population criteria. That's exactly what Ken described, was this species prioritization process. We can't dig into all species, it's just impossible. So what are those really important key species across all taxa, across all habitats, that we need to start looking at in much more detail so they don't move into that threatened and endangered status. I have to just emphasize, we have to avoid threatened and endangered species status for all sorts of reasons, because at that point it becomes political. At that point it starts costing tens of millions of dollars, unless you're a Hawaiian threatened and endangered species, and that never seems to get enough money to do what they need to do to save those species. But we need to avoid that process as much as we possibly can. So this is why we started off with that species prioritization process that Ken described yesterday. And then there's going to be tinkering there. We presented that out there. We're hoping to continue to think about that as much as we possibly can. We also need to make sure that we're all okay with a species assessment, doing species level information, gathering more scientific information. I'll never forget, starting off as a young scientist, the pushback I got from conservation biologists about the idea of collecting more data. We need to collect more data. Science is good. There was this pushback on science. And I think we're seeing the impacts of that even now and today. But the importance of the science, the quantitative approaches, analyzing existing data, or even going out and collecting new data like tracking data or mapping out genoscapes is essential to the recovery. We need to be willing to accept that fact. That is essential. So what we're proposing here, just to be clear, is that we need to dig in and to try to determine what the limiting factors are, what the drivers are of decline, of population dynamics for these priority species. And then, if possible, where management action is going to get us the biggest bang for our buck. So we need to look at those possible management actions as well, as Jim just described. It's really critical. But that's why we sort of jumped in for these 2 days and sort of looking at those limiting factors. So in essence, we're proposing that we exercise greater oversight and take accountability for the success of more bird species than we've been doing, more than just the waterfowl or the game species, more than just species once they slide into T&E status. That threshold of species that need our help, that need our oversight, that need our management, for lack of a better term, is grown significantly. It's really important. This will involve greater amounts of cooperation. It's going to involve greater funding and work between public and private sectors. But folks, I just keep coming back to this as I think about this amount of work that we're going to have to deal with. Is what's the alternative? I really don't know what the alternative is unless we start to think about triage, and I'm just not willing to do that. I'm just not willing to go there. And again, it's probably going to mean more science, but science is a good thing. But I'm not suggesting we go out and just collect random data. I'm suggesting we become very organized and very strategic in what we collect and how we apply this to species management. It's essential. And how we oversee this process for recovery for species not always listed. So again, we stop them from sliding into that status. So this workshop was about the limiting factors and thinking about how different species have approached this and different people have approached this. We envision sort of the next workshop being more about migratory connectivity and quantifying linked populations throughout the annual cycle using existing tools. We heard from several folks out there today and yesterday how important it would have been to have tracking data, or how important it would have been to have a genoscape. Well, there's now new tools for doing this. So in this next workshop, I think digging into those new science tools and how they'll provide these advances to estimating population limitation will be really essential. And doing that throughout the annual cycle, it's going to be critical. So we see this as a discussion, as a dialogue, but it's also something we see as a sort of a two-phase process. So I'm going to share my screen, and Ken and I are going to talk about this in a little more detail with how we see this moving forward. Tom, is that sharing properly?
Yes, you're good.
Great. So we see this, sorry, let me do that there. See this as being sort of a two steps, and these two steps they may be acting simultaneously. The first is really advancing the science, and the second is engaging the scientific community. Let me explain in a little more detail what we're thinking here. So the first step of that is, as Steve described yesterday, as Ken went into in detail, determining what the priority species are for these species-specific approaches. Once we know that, we need to go through and use that existing ACAD database and start identifying the knowledge gaps. There's actually quite a bit of data already in there, but we're filling in these data gaps. For some of these species, we know the migratory connectivity. There are certain species where we have vital rate information, or we have life history traits. There's also people that are already out there working on these species. We need to bring those people into these conversations to see what they need, what else we need to know. It's important to identify those gaps. And then we can start doing the science. We can start prioritizing the science. I think we have to do this within a structured decision-making framework, as Jim and Boomer described, Scott described. But it's important that we start to do that. And we can do that with existing data. That's really important, as Viviana emphasized, because there's lots of existing data out there, but also new data. But it's about being really strategic in gathering and focusing in on the data that we need to really determine what those limiting factors are, or what we can tweak out there to start reversing the declines. That's what's essential. Engaging the community is this other piece of this that's really important, because we're not proposing inventing new structures or new groups out there. There's lots of great groups out there like Partners in Flight, NABC, Fish and Wildlife Service, academic groups that are already taking this on and thinking about these issues. It's about engaging those groups to try to work with them to take on these additional responsibilities. If it means starting new groups, well, we can have that conversation, but that's not our goal. Our goal is to sort of push those groups to do this species-specific work, or to help them in doing that work. Another piece of this has also been identified. I think Jim's examples with red knots was really made this clear. It's important to identify the management options, and Steve did as well. It may be that because of changes in precipitation, there isn't really much you can do about that. So what else in the system can you really tweak? Can you really manage to have an impact? So it's important to identify those simultaneously to these other efforts. And then this all needs to be wrapped up into what we've been calling conservation business plans. And it's really the marrying of the science, the strategy in a business framework. So we know the costs associated with carrying this whole process out. Ideally, we're not doing this for 46 different species. Hopefully, we'll be lumping these into broader groupings, so we're not writing multiple conservation business plans, but we have to see how this proceeds as we move forward. So I'm going to turn this over to Ken, and we're probably going to go back and forth a bit more on this. Ken, are you out there?
Yeah,
Ken?
I think I'm
There?
here.
Okay.
Video.
Just let me know when I need me to flip the slides.
All
So
right.
this is, go ahead, I'll let you take off.
Oh, I'm starting now.
Yeah, you're starting now.
All right, well, I'm going to also start, kind of in this awkward format by thanking everybody. And, I was really struck by this whole array of talks, especially the case studies that we heard today, in how different, sort of the different starting place we are really for so many of these different groups of birds. We're starting with different data sets. We're starting in some cases with different knowledge, even of population trajectories. We're starting with, in some cases, really different goals about reversing the declines. For harvested species, there's this whole other element that we just don't have. What are we going to do? Set a eBird frequency goal for Sprague's pipit, and that's what we're going to try to achieve. So just finding these equivalencies and finding ways of applying some of these case studies to these other bird groups, I think is an exciting part of the ongoing discussion. And I don't know, to me, one of the very last things that was said in answer to Tom's question which is really important that both Jim and Scott answered, and that is about framing. The frame of these questions is so important, and I think as was used in the red knot example, if you're not looking at it at the right scale or framing it in the right context, you're not even going to be asking the right questions. And for so many of our birds, we're still in this kind of back and forth. Is it the wintering ground? Is it the breeding ground? And is it habitat or is it something else? So we've really, that brings me to the other big take home that I heard, which was right at the very beginning from Steve Beisinger's talk, this way of organizing our information in a framework that allows us to put these things into alternative hypotheses and then test that. I mean, it's a morass of information that in some cases we're trying to gather or that we have. And I think this idea of a better way of organizing that information, and when asked, where would you start with a bird that we don't know much about, which was Tom's question to Steve, he thought about it and said, well, we start just by listing what do we know about this bird? What is the information that we have? And then what don't we know? And then organizing that. So that's really what this next little piece is about. So we've done a process for selecting a group of birds. There are 46 species on this list right now that meet these criteria of high vulnerability, they're in steep decline, and they're showing, to the best of our knowledge, a high degree of urgency in terms of their populations steeply declining, projected to steeply decline in the future. And what we're envisioning and what Pete just laid out is a process for moving those birds along a recovery planning process, this road to recovery. So what we're envisioning, and I guess you could go to the next slide, is really a pyramid where we've come up with a seven-step scale, a 7-point scale for this, but that's not necessarily set in stone. It could be 10 steps, it could be fewer. But the idea here is that we can evaluate each of these species, and we're proposing to start with these 46 species, but eventually we do want to fill in the matrix of information for more species. So, and then thinking about where are we in this scale for each of these birds, and then moving them along from the case of say number 1, for some of these birds that might not have even been on some of our priority lists yet. This is the first time we're really seeing information about their declines, and we're starting almost from scratch in terms of understanding why they might be declining. So these birds are at the bottom of the pyramid. And as we advance them along this scale, we're also interested in evaluating where we are for each species. And we're envisioning, and maybe this is the way the State of the Birds reports are going into the future, but evaluating where these birds are along this scale and when can we move a bird from a 1 to a 2 or a 2 to a 3. So go on to the next one. So we've taken a stab at defining 7 of these steps in this pyramid. And again, this is all open to further discussion and review. There are a lot of birds, probably a majority of birds in this 3X category are at stage 2, where they've been on priority lists, they've been recognized as a conservation concern, and we know they're declining, but there's very little information on what those causes of declines are. And maybe people have started to think about it, and I've got some examples here, and they might not be correct. For example, the rufous hummingbird, there's now an entire group that's come together, the Western Hummingbird Partnership, thinking about these hummingbirds that are declining and what's happening to them as they move into Mexico. So number 2 is where probably a lot of these species are. If we move ahead, up to number 3, there are a number of birds that some working groups have just begun to form. I'm part of a group with blackpoll warblers. It's pretty interesting. recognizing these declines, in some cases questioning the trend data itself and trying to get a better handle on whether these birds are declining that steeply, where they're declining. Desert Thrasher group has come together. There's a Chimney Swift group. So there are groups coming together, beginning to identify knowledge gaps, but still not really much targeted conservation action that's even possible for these birds yet, because there's so much we don't know. And then what we want to do is move them up to the next stage. So number 4 are some birds where they've actually been included in some pretty good conservation plans, in some cases even conservation business plans, these investment strategies that have identified these birds. And so bobolink, some of the shorebirds that are included in the shorebird plan. There's an entire black rail plan that includes a lot of data and modeling. So that's the next stage we want to do. But then we want to keep moving birds along this road to recovery, and get to the point where we've got conservation business plans that are including these species, that are including demographic information, where we have a pretty good idea of what the limiting factors and causes of declines are, that we've got a strategy for addressing the broad threats that are influencing those declines, and that some of that action is beginning and we're testing it, and we've got some costs associated with that. And cerulean warbler, golden wing warbler working groups might be a good example of where there's been a lot of attention to these birds, but we still don't really know, and we're not really addressing necessarily the causes of declines. And then as we get closer, we're going to have species where we essentially have recovery plan modules that are inside these business plans, inside joint venture plans, inside some of the other conservation plans. And they might be at that point multiple species plans, but what we're thinking of as this module of a recovery plan starts out by being species specific, that we've got information on the causes of decline, we know what to do about it, and some of that work is being done in an adaptive framework. And so sage grouse, salt marsh sparrows on the Atlantic coast might be examples of birds where we've got a lot of the information, we know what to do, we have those plans in place, but we haven't yet implemented the recovery of those species. And where we want to get to with all these species is a recovery process, whether it's full recovery or at least implementation of a recovery plan for these species that is working, in some cases like with Kirtland's warbler, working to the point where the bird could be delisted. In the case of oystercatcher, a lot of resources going into targeted actions that are increasing populations of oystercatchers on the Atlantic coast. So as Pete says, this is not replacing ongoing habitat work that's happening or broad conservation work to address threats. But as he said, if we're only doing that broad stuff, then these birds could be slipping through the cracks. So we're envisioning a very concerted and targeted recovery effort for these birds that are going to move birds along this scale, and that will be able to monitor and evaluate that progress and know at each time in future years whether we're moving birds from a 3 to a 4, a 4 to a 5, and eventually to recovery. So that's our vision for how we're hoping to use the species prioritization matrix and use this scaled approach to recovery. And it's going to begin by filling in what we already know about these species and filling in, as I mentioned yesterday, we've got columns in the ACAD database now to fill in species information in this matrix. Some groups have already begun to do that. Partners in Flight Science Committee, they're populating this matrix to find out whether species in this top tier are grouped with other species in habitat and geographic clusters. That information is starting to go in, and information from the individual working groups where they exist on these species. So we're going to know pretty shortly where we are, what the status of each of these birds is along this pyramid. And then our process is envisioning research and conservation actions that are moving birds along this scale.
Thanks.
So
One thing I'd like to add is, I mean, basically what we're proposing here, again, I think we've said this, we've sort of beaten the dead cat here, but we're proposing, just like we do with waterfowl, or we monitor, that Scott described, we monitor on an annual basis and we look at how their populations are changing and what needs to be tweaked, or we do with threatened and endangered species. We're proposing we expand the list of species that we do that with in an organized and strategic fashion. And that's sort of the process for moving these species to recovery. Tom, you want to, anything else, Ken?
yeah, didn't you have a last slide, or you?
Oh, was there a last slide? Oh, we did. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah, so I know we're running a little bit late, so I'm hoping that people will be able to stay on for another 8 minutes at least. And what I'm asking, the chat, the general chat for participants and panelists is now open to all. And so what I'm asking is that folks take the next 5 minutes to, and then I'll end that 5-minute period and bring us all back together for just a 2-minute or a 3-minute wrap up. But I want you to take the next 5 minutes to sort of look at that chat and just start writing down what your ideas are for what are the best next steps we can take for moving the science forward, for identifying causes of decline. You know, is it a workshop? If it's a workshop, what should it be focused on? That kind of thing, whatever comes to your mind. And also in general, what are the big things that we need to focus on as next steps that involve the entire conservation community, not just the science community. So, you know, just allow yourself to brainstorm into the chat for the next 5 minutes, and we'll collect all that information and pull it together in the near future. So please have at it.
So this is the chat, not Q&A, right, Tom?
This is the chat, right? And I see people are starting to add to that right now.
Hey, Tom, are you there?
I'm here.
I know we're supposed to be meditating, but I just am really inspired by these comments.
Yeah, this is good. So this is Tom again, and I want to be respectful of your time. I want to thank everybody for for being in attendance at the workshop. I think it's really fantastic, and I hope we all know that this is just a beginning of a process that's going to be long and exciting, but in the end is going to get us to a point where we can really say, look back and say, we saved bird species, we really did our jobs, and we did it well. So that's the future that we look forward to. I like to think of this process that we're involved in as kind of a braided river. Imagine those braided streams that sometimes go on different courses, and the science, the work on the pure science is part of that, but that it's part of a stream that comes back and joins another stream, which is the stream of conservation delivery. And all these things are flowing in parallel with one another, but the point of a braided river is that they're connected to one another and they continue that connection. And I think that's our goal. When we get to the ocean is really bringing back 3 billion birds. And hopefully we'll stand on the shore someday and we'll look out to sea and we'll say, yeah, we did our job, we brought them back. And then we can turn around and look back to where the rivers came from, and we can say, yeah, we did it, and we really worked well together to do that. I just want everybody to know that we'll follow up the workshop with an email that will give you links to the recordings and to the chat and the Q&A and to some of the products that you've been introduced to during the workshop. So this workshop is just the beginning. I thank you for your time. I'm going to hope that we can leave the chat open until 3 o'clock or four until the end of the hour, depending on where you are. But I want to remind everybody that after the workshop is over, we still have that shared folder on a Google Drive where there's a comment board where you can continue these conversations and add your thoughts and also your announcements and anything related to the road to recovery for birds can be entered into that Google Doc. And so that's going to be a record of continuing conversation until we all get back and figure out what come together and figure out the next step. So again, the vision is to turn around and see how well we've worked together to reach that final goal of recovering our North American avifauna. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye, but leave the chat open for the rest of the hour. Thanks. for everybody for your participation.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you,
Tom.
everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks very, very much. This is just the beginning. It's very exciting.